Okay, for today's lesson, we're going to be talking about domain and range of exponential functions. We are going to determine the domain and range of exponential functions of the form f of x is equal to a times b to the power of x. And we're going to represent the domain and range using inequalities. This lesson is going to seem very familiar to you because we have studied domain and range before. We studied with linear functions, the straight line functions, with quadratics, the parabola or U-shaped graphs. And now we're going to look at how is domain and range different when we are looking at an exponential function. So remember, if you recall, domain has to do with the directions left and right because those are x values and the x-axis travels left and right. So the domain of a relation is the set, meaning there's more than one of all x values or inputs. Okay, so domain, inputs, x values, those are all words for the same thing. And we're going to move from left to right, again, because the x-axis moves in a left to right direction. So we're going to look at the first graph here at the bottom. We're going to look at these graphs, and we're going to find the domain of both. So the first thing I'm going to ask is, how far left on the x-axis do I need to go to find the domain? And if you see, you run into an arrow, which means I am actually moving in two directions. I am moving in an upward and left direction at the same time. That's why that graph is going at an angle. But the only direction I'm concerned with is the left direction because that has to do with the movement for domain. So I cannot draw a boundary because I am actually going out to negative infinity, which is not an exact number. So I can't say I have an exact stopping point. So I'm going to actually turn around, and now I'm going to ask myself, how far right on the x-axis do I need to go before I stop having an exponential graph? And you can see we run into another arrow on the right end, which tells me I'm now going towards positive infinity, which means I do not have a stopping point and I cannot draw a boundary. Well, if you go all of the x values on the left and you're using all the x values going to the right, you are actually have a domain of all real numbers. Now, you can also abbreviate all real numbers by using that double R. Okay, that double R. So you may see either, all real numbers. That's if you have arrows at both ends. You know you're going all the way left and all the way right. So now let's look at this graph. Again, I want to find the domain. And if they give you the graph, they are going to be very clear about there being an arrow, and they're going to be very clear about there being a stopping or an endpoint. So you should not have to guess, is this going on forever or not, because your graph picture that's given to you is going to be very clear on that. So again, for domain, I'm going to ask myself, how far left do I need to go on the x-axis before I can stop? And the answer is I can go to 0. So I'm going to draw a boundary line where x is at 0. And now I'm going to write my inequality. So I'm going to say x is greater than 0 because if I look at my boundary line, my graph is drawn on the side of the boundary line where the x values get greater or bigger than 0. So now I need to look and decide, do I need to make this greater than or equal to? And the answer is yes, because I have a solid line, a solid point. And now, since I have a boundary line, now I'm going to turn around and I'm going to ask myself, how far right do I need to go? Well, if I look at the right end of my picture, I see an arrow, which tells me since it's angled, I'm actually moving in two directions. I am moving up and I am moving to the right. But the only direction I am concerned with is the right direction because domain means left and right. And that tells me if it's going to the right, I am never stopping. I'm heading towards positive infinity and I cannot draw a boundary. So my domain becomes the boundary line inequality. X is greater than or equal to 0. I'm going to start making my list of all my x values. I'm going to include 0 since there's a bar, and I'm going to write every place value of x that I can, and then I'm going to get to 1. And then I'm going to write every place value of x that I can get to between 1 and 2 and write 2. So my list of x's is very, very long, which is why we're using an inequality.